and welcome to the FinTech Finance Arena. I'm your host, Doug Mackenzie, and on today's session, we're going to be talking about taking the initiative in payments and innovating beyond the central infrastructure. And joining me today, I have two guest speakers who are right at the core of what we're going to be talking about today. And first up, we have Martina Weimert from the EPA. Martina, how are you doing here today?
Fine, thank you. Thanks.
Amazing. Now, could you tell our viewers, who might not be aware, just a bit of background to what you've been working on over at the European Payments Initiative, please?
Yeah, so the European Payments Initiative is the idea to create a payment solution tailor-made for Europe by European ecosystem players, namely banks and big third-party providers. And we try to build a new solution around a card, a European card, but also a full-fledged digital STT solution and a wallet.
Amazing. Well, excellent. Thank you so much for joining us here today on the panel. And also, we have Craig Ramsey from ACI Worldwide. Hey, Craig, thank you so much for joining. How are you doing here today as well?
I'm fabulous. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Now, Craig, could you also tell our viewers who might not be aware what you've been kind of working on over at ACI and maybe ACI itself, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Craig Ramsey. I'm head of real-time payments for the banking segment at ACI. So that's mostly a strategic and market proposition role, just analyzing different markets around the world. ACI, for those that don't know, we are a 45-year-old company, and we provide the end-to-end solutions for payments that our banks, merchants, and billers use in order to acquire, process, and indeed clear and settle their transactions. So we're primarily a software solution provider, with the emphasis being on the solution. We're not just a toolkit and gun for hire. We're very much focused on local market propositions and how we solve that local market proposition.
Amazing. Now, it really does seem like that, the payments industry really has just become an ecosystem with lots of players interconnected, and I think that's only going to increase. So, could we talk more about that ecosystem? Martina, if I come to you first, and then Craig, if I come to you, can you tell us where the EPI sits in the payments ecosystem, in and amongst all these banks? Do they join your organization, and what's their input in that?
Yeah, it was a solution which was initially launched, in the early days as a project or feasibility study by banks, and they were then joined by third-party acquirers. So the idea of the ecosystem is basically in the DNA of the solution, meaning we try to come together with a full-fledged ecosystem on the issuing and the acquiring side, now also involving processes and building up the relationship with the merchants and the consumer associations. So the idea here is to propose a European ecosystem. We know all that if you are just serving one side, you will never be successful. So we are trying to do it on both sides in parallel in order to become very early out there on the market and to be successful. So that is for us the whole initial setup. Then, of course, we will have to involve other players and more markets will come along. More banks are now requesting to join EPI. More acquirers and e-commerce acceptance providers also, and we are building up our own technology platform in order to allow the connectivity among all these players.
Incredible. Now, also Craig as well, can you tell me more about where ACI also sits in that ecosystem as well, because there are so many interconnected players, sorry.
Well, the EPI is a great example of what I would refer to as an overlay service, a scheme on top of the real-time rails. There's been a lot of talk in the industry and obviously a lot of movement in, over 70 countries worldwide have deployed real-time rails to enable account-to-account real-time instant transactions. But that wasn't the nirvana, that wasn't the endpoint. The endpoint is when you start to see schemes and new overlay services actually driving the need for those real-time rails. I liken it to the railroads and the rail tracks that were built, a couple of centuries ago now, but They were built not because people liked the look of the rail tracks, but because of what they could do. They could join communities together. And that's exactly what we're seeing with EPI and other services and schemes around the world, where it's joining up consumers to their businesses. It's linking merchants to their customers and giving them new ways to pay and be paid, which speeds up liquidity, it speeds up reconciliation, and it lowers the cost of the transactions for people. So there's lots of win points across the industry. ACI's goal there is to help the consumers, the banks, the merchants, the billers to connect to these schemes. We are also a central infrastructure provider around the world, but predominantly for EPI, it's about helping those parties leverage EPI, connect to it, get the most out of it, and then really importantly, stay current to it. EPI, and I'm sure Martina will comment, is not a point in time, it's the start of a very long journey. And it's the start of a very important journey as we modernize payments in Europe. And that's really what has to be thought about. You don't just create a business case for when EPI will go live. ACI will help you not just be ready for that go live, but help you stay current with new products, new services, and new mandates as they come out to strengthen the EPI business case.
Yeah, maybe I should jump in there. That's perfectly right. And the way how we perceive this is, yes, it was necessary to build on, well, the official rule book, which exists in instant payments in Europe. But yeah, as Craig said, that only does, well, some rule setting and is in the back. Then what you need is a full-fledged front-end solution and all the rules that go with this. So we have a front-end solution and we have a middle layer that we are building to allow all this. The interest from an infrastructure perspective is, of course, that then you get to something which is much more scalable, which has a lot of synergies compared to all the infrastructures that we see today in the various European markets. So we are definitely also on a scale game here. And by trying to implement latest technology, become much more agile and allowing the future solution to have every year new services, because, well, infrastructure is only nice as long as it facilitates then the additional value that you potentially can create there. So that is our challenge, and I agree it's a very long journey because, yeah, we are not starting on a greenfield approach. We have to migrate a lot of things, which, well, the idea is not to take the old stuff and transfer it to the new platform, but to say, well, we don't want to lose the clients. We don't want to destroy the value and the trust that has been built up since years. But on the other side, we really need a new solution, a different way of functioning in order to be more cost efficient, more agile, and ultimately much more innovative.
Yeah. Now, Martina, if I could stick with you then, you know, we hear a lot about these innovations, but as you mentioned, we've been building and you've been building off previous legacy systems from an industry that maybe wasn't so innovative 15 years ago. And it's starting to kind of roll and really become quite interesting and dynamic now, especially when you hear about instant payments and how critical they've been to businesses and consumers around the world. But do you really think that it's achieved the new normal that people really think it has?
No, I think it's a hope or it's a promise. It's definitely not the new normal as of now. Again, I mean, cards have developed for more than over 40 years. You will not achieve that in a couple of years to build the new normal or the future mainstream means of payment. So I think we are only at the beginning of that journey. We have now figured out, okay, the clearing and settlement layer. I hope with API we have the middle layer there and the rules that we need, especially for commerce and all kind of situations that you can face in commerce, like chargebacks, refund, etc. Yeah. So these kind of things are important, and then we'll start only the part to innovative solutions on top of it. So far, I don't think at all that we are in the new normal. You need to make sure that it is as convenient, ubiquitous, secure than what you have today. And then on top, you need to provide additional value, because otherwise, why would somebody, especially the consumer, change, right? So before you are not at that level, it's useless to believe that you achieved it. And in our case, that means also inventing a new business model and inventing new payment situations that go with it. So we think that we can offer through instant payments much more use cases than with cards. There are many more situations, unattended commerce and so on, which you can much easier provide for with instant payments. So that's very interesting. We also think, well, you have to offer in the future this kind of choice to the consumer, right? So definitely not here for the moment. And maybe as a last remark, the new normal will be achieved not only when it's fully implemented in commerce and in all kind of commerce situation, but also when you will be able to transact internationally as easily as today on national grounds. And I ask you, who is providing today the infrastructure to allow international, instant, real-time, faster, call it what you want, transactions? There is nobody who allows this so far. And so it's definitely not on the level as is cards, which is available everywhere, cross-border functioning as well as national transactions. So a long way to go still.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think like that, because it does mean that there's so much more room to innovate going into the future. You know, we're not done. We've just, it's the beginning. And I'm really excited to maybe hear some of those kind of value propositions that you were mentioning. So Craig, if I could come to you, Martina's laid down, as you were saying, the groundwork has been laid down, but now we've got to kind of entice people to really see the benefits and what really could those new use cases be for consumers or businesses to kind of leverage on that?
Well, gosh, how long's your videotape? Because we could be here for quite some time, quite frankly. But, joking aside, I agree with Martina. It's not the new normal yet, because there's such a weight of old transactions in the old schemes. And one of the things that the payments industry is very bad at is shutting down old schemes. We love new stuff, but we don't like getting rid of old stuff. But if we just focus on the innovation space, that's not happening particularly much in cards. It's not happening in checks. It's certainly not happening in cash, despite the UK's new fancy polymer notes. But the reality is that the innovation is taking place in the instant payment space. And that's because that's where the use cases that consumers and businesses expect. Firstly, everything we do as consumers now is real time. It's instant gratification. It's instant data feedback. When I buy something from a website, I'm instantly looking to know where it is, when's it going to be delivered, where it is in the tracking. It's the Amazon approach. And that's our expectation in payments too. So if we think about some of the use cases, the biggest use case that we see in instant payments normally, to start with, anywhere in the world, is a P2P use case, which ironically you can't do with a card. I can't pay you with my credit card unless you're, got your own little card machine, and I'm guessing you don't. So the P2P use case, but it's so much more than that. If we think about as a temporary worker or a gig worker, they typically do short-term jobs and could be paid instantly at the end of their shift. They shouldn't have to wait 2 weeks or a month to be paid, which is a huge amount of time in a lot of these people's own personal liquidity. So they can be paid quicker. If I was an Uber driver, I could be paid at the end of my shift. I could instantly sort that out, and I can work as much or as little as I want. If I think about merchants, we've already spoken about how obviously EPI will drive to merchants, but the e-commerce websites with their request to pay gives us new ways of engaging merchants and consumers together, which is no harder than using a credit card online. And to a lot of consumers, they'll feel more comfortable using a request to pay like service because it comes with the use of their own phone, their own banking technology. They haven't had to share any credit card details anywhere. Billers, another great example. that actually boosts customer experience for a biller. It stops payments being rejected. And if you are someone like Netflix, having rejects on your payments is probably one of your biggest concerns. So if we can drive instant payments and again, probably using the request to pay scenarios to actually reduce those reductions, you've got a much more profitable business, or rather you're not spending as much money on your exceptions. It also provides faster and better reconciliation with the data that's contained within the payment. I can go on. Insurance company disbursements, being able to get money into an area that's just had an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane, whatever it may be. That there are use cases where people need to be paid instantly. It's not just about feeling as though it's instant. The beneficiary needs the money, and they want to be able to reuse the money instantly, and that's what we can do with instant payments.
Well, I think that's so exciting, because to me that boils down what fintech is all about. It's about looking at the ways that we've been doing things before for 200, 300 years and actually reevaluating them and realizing that people don't want the typical systems that we've had, and actually the technology is there to supplement that. We now need to bring that to bear. Now, Martina, with that in mind, then how will the new EPI initiative benefit consumers? We've heard about the merchants, obviously, but how will the EPI initiative benefit consumers and also businesses alike?
Yeah, so first of all, I think what we try to offer is one digital interface, which will allow the consumer to access the full range of the solution. So it's not just P2P, P2Pro, or commerce payments, so in stores, online, e-commerce. It's also cash withdrawal. So the full range, and not just particular payment situations, plus these new situations to which I alluded before, which are more linked to the instant payment, unattended commerce, etc. So this first idea of one digital interface allowing to do everything and also benefiting from a full range of value-added services. So the first one we will start with is instant financing, which is a kind of buy now, pay later installment or invoice payment solution going up to a consumer loan. Which will be also available and just in a click instead of having to enroll, going to a different solution and so on. So real instant value for the consumer and smoothness, easiness in terms of usage. The fundamental choice of EPI has been to say, well, I let the consumer choose between the two main means of payment, so cards and STT Inst, which is, I think, very important in today's European landscape, because we see that today in Europe, we have people who are really digital and would love to do everything with their wallets, their smartphone, and so on. But we also have other people who are still very much attached to the piece of plastic. So here you have the full choice. You can combine them. You can use them only for certain situations or preferences that we can define, and also allow a multi-banking functioning, so having multiple accounts linked for the STT Inst solution in the same interface. So I think that is what API will offer in the first place, with, of course, the basic conditions of convenience, the full-fledged acceptance network, the security that the banks can offer. And I think the security aspect, especially for instant payment, is quite important, because right now, if we don't take a very big step forward in terms of fraud prevention, instant payments will become the new go-to in terms of security breaches and so on. Because of course, as there is much less data available about instant payments, hackers will immediately use that in order to develop, well, their own approaches there. So I think it's crucial to have a combined solution and offer better fraud prevention, including for instant payments. So that is what we will come up with at the beginning. And then of course, the challenge will be to increase the services, offer new things. And we identified through consumer research many other services that are requested by the consumers, a little bit depending on which markets they're coming from, but mostly nevertheless quite shared. So we identified like 6 services which we really see as crucial for Europe. So we will try to do our best to implement them as soon as possible on top of the basic solution and the first value-added service.
That's absolutely incredible. You know, I love hearing this concept of choice, because it's always been, you know, the mantra, you pay in just the kind of the bare minimum way you can. But now when you're given the option, you've seen from, as you mentioned, Martina, customers want that. Customers actually have been crying out for that, and they haven't been given the option to have that choice. And now we're starting to see that. And also it goes back to you talking about laying that groundwork first, ensuring that it's safe, ensuring that it's secure in such a regulated industry. That's so critical to then be able to go on and bring on those incredible value added solutions that we see. Now, Craig, I'm also interested, you've heard from Martina's perspective from the inside. I'm also interested in your perspective on how you think the industry will be ready to support the Epi Initiative, and maybe even also ACI's perspective too.
Well, real time's not going anywhere. It's the the big new thing. More services will be added to the real-time rails that we see today, and indeed we'll see more real-time rails. But as consumers and businesses and merchants, they'll be less worried about the rails than the banks should be focused on. So the banks will be the payment service providers, in order to get into the rails, and then they will offer different rails for different services. So as consumers, you're absolutely right about the choice. I will buy from merchants, and I will interact with biller companies where I feel comfortable transacting with them. And that includes the payments experience. If I feel that I'm not using a payments experience that I feel is safe, I'm not going to use it. It's as simple as that. And unfortunately, the world is scattered with examples of schemes going live that haven't had the fraud protections attached to them. And within days, it's lost its credibility in the market. We've learned a lot from that. There's an industry, and we know much better how to address that today. But ultimately, I'm going to transact with the parties that I want to transact with. So that will include offering me the choice of how to pay. So as a bank or a financial institution, I need to have the right ecosystem in place in order to enable the fintechs to work with me, because a lot of the innovation is going to come from the fintech community as they identify new products and services. I, as a payment service provider, not me personally, but pretending I'm a bank or financial institution, as a payment service provider, need to make the availability of clearing and settlement mechanisms part of the process and the product that I offer into the market. So you've got to have strong orchestration, you've got to have strong decisioning on which clearing and settlement mechanism to use, you've got to have strong fraud protection in place, you've got to have exceptions processing in place, and all of that needs to be running 24/7. We don't live in a 9-to-5 world anymore, and payments can't work 9 to 5, so banks cannot work 9 to 5. And so it has to be a full 24/7 operation nowadays.
I agree. And as someone that works from 8 to 6, having that old school system, you really need to kind of change that, and it does make it the whole perspective. And I know we've been talking a lot about how it impacts businesses, but it really does showcase how payments just go through the whole financial ecosystem and impact people from customer experience to businesses just trying to get that money through in an instant way, and it really has a very human element to it. Now, one thing that also, Craig, if I could stick with you as well for this one as well, is we've seen a number of new international standards change this ecosystem because they're updating the way that this data gets sent around. One obviously is ISO 20022. Now, Craig, how do you think that's going to impact even local, regional, or even global payment corridors now that there's an influx in the quality and quantity of data within a payment?
ISO 20022 provides the framework that we need to add the innovation on top. It in itself is just another data standard, but it happens to be rich enough with the right individual message types that can enable real-time payments. So if we think back. I mean, real-time payments isn't new. It's actually coming up to 50 years old. Not quite as old as me, but hey, it's nearly 50. And what we're seeing there is that the initial schemes that rolled out use proprietary standards, even 85, 83 to get live. What we see now, and what we've seen consistently for 10 years, is ISO 20022 being the de facto standard for all real-time schemes. And then if that's enabled within the rails, within the clearing and settlement mechanism, then what we've got then is the ability to add sufficient data to support the overlay services on top. And I mentioned it earlier about the faster and simpler reconciliation for billers and corporates. Well, that's as a direct result of having enough data in the payment through the ISO 20022 to make that a reality. There shouldn't be any more conversation about ISO 20022. It's here. It does a great job for us within the real-time world. It opens up the standards. Martina mentioned cross-border payments earlier. SWIFT is making its move to MX standards, the ISO 20022 standards. We see high-value RTGS systems around the world changing to ISO 20022 as well. So it's no longer a conversation. It should be done. And if you haven't got deep, thorough, and embedded ISO 20022 capabilities within your ERP system, within your banking interface, within your banking processing, or within your clearing and settlement mechanism, you're way behind the times.
Yeah, with that in mind, Martina, Craig called out the fact at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned one of the biggest use cases of why we're not there yet is because of the lacking cross-border side of things. So do you think ISO 20022 is actually going to, I mean, Craig's already mentioned that it has to, you have to have that embedded. Do you think that, just having that and the increasing customer demand, as well as the huge changes in global standards, what are some of the next steps to tackle some of these challenges?
Well, I think especially on that cross-border part, one of the challenges is there needs to be somebody who does not consider this as, well, just the tiny part of its own transactions. Meaning, if you look at Europeans, depending on the market you're focusing on, it's never more than 10% of your transactions. So is it worthwhile to say for these 10% and maybe 10% or 5% from other markets, I set up this kind of connectivity to other platforms? Do we need a conversion layer in between? Because, well, even if we are all in the future on ISO 20022, we might need nevertheless additional features of conversion in order to allow that different solutions can function and work together. Because at the end, it's allowing the flow to happen, but it's also the compatibility of the solution itself. If I have a solution, let's say just both solutions work with a QR code. One could work push, the other could work pull. That doesn't allow you to have transactions going through. So if I would go from one country to another and all of a sudden my push solution is not working anymore because guess what, in that market it is a pull solution, then it doesn't help neither. So I think it takes much more than just to say, okay, we have a common standard somewhere in the back, or we have a platform allowing that connectivity. It needs to have a full thought through process and ways of functioning. That's why it is very difficult to envisage that anytime soon, instant or real time or faster will displace the cards. Because, well, we have seen it. It has taken such a long time. And actually also the fact that there were bigger or dominant players that could impose that functioning to the whole world. We are not in that landscape right now. And so I think it will be very challenging. Either there will be somebody picking it up, doing the homework of making things compatible and workable in a cross-border mode. Otherwise, well, this will be very national or local for a very long time. And so stay always in a kind of a second best or niche positioning versus becoming really fully internationally accepted and mainstream.
Interesting. So Craig, do you agree that there has to be that kind of interconnectivity to really break through and become mainstream, as Martina was saying there?
Very short answer, yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thankful.
Well, and Craig, I mean, do you agree that those are the next steps? You mentioned obviously several global organizations like Swift are looking at onboarding, embedding ISO right in the core of their cross-border situations. But do you agree that these are going to be the next steps to actual creating this cross-border uniform real-time payment standard?
Yeah, ISO 20022. It's not a single point in time. We should also recognize that as well. Just because someone is supporting ISO 20022, if one's supporting version 2 and the other one's supporting version 5, then we've already got a discrepancy. But it's sufficiently a common layer that there's enough to work with there. So there'll always be the need to have specific rules around cross-border payments. Just because both sides are talking ISO 20022 doesn't mean it magically works. So there'll always be an interoperability phase. We also need to think about, if we're moving payments around the world, if we're not using the correspondent banking rails that exist today, how are we settling those transactions? Are we looking on, and this is a whole extra conversation which we're not going to get into here, but do we need central bank digital currencies to support those cross-border transactions? A lot of the cross-border services now that aren't with the banks are merely wallets that are happening, and the transactions are effectively happening outside of the standard banking system, which obviously doesn't give everyone thorough visibility of those transactions. But we need to look at the cross-border payment propositions. We need to look at the corridors that matter. There's no point trying to just hook up everyone to everyone. Which are the corridors where we can make the most difference? Is it in the traditional remittance market, for example, as a way to start looking at those? Is it consumer payments? Is it B2B payments? And a lot of people will instantly focus on, well, let's go after the remittance corridors. But the reality is of the $156 trillion of international trade every year, 150 trillion of it is based on B2B payments. So we need to focus on where we can make a difference.
Incredible, guys. Thank you so much for your insights. I think we're coming to time. And what's really spoken to me is the fact that we are laying this framework, this groundwork to go on and innovate in exponentially innovative new ways, to reuse the word. But thank you so much both for your insights. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I hope you've both enjoyed yourselves as well.
Always.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also to our viewers, you can catch the rest of the series and much more over at fintechfinancenews.com, and of course on YouTube and LinkedIn, where I will see you in the comments. And to everyone, thanks once again, and goodbye.